Hi, and welcome to Mindrolling. Your two mind rollers are back here for another week of adventures in consciousness. And this is Raghu Marcus, and
I'm David Silver, and our podcast this time is really about spirituality and politics, politics and spirituality. And also, this podcast will be the first that goes to realitysandwich.com, which is an amazing website, an incubator for consciousness exploration of all kinds. And we're very happy that they're going to be highlighting or spotlighting, or at least giving us space on their real estate for our venture here. But Roger, let's
well, wait. I wanted to talk about they're obviously most well known for the intersection of psychedelics and consciousness, and we've talked so much about our whole lives were thrust into the arms of the East, shall we say, and into more of understanding reality because of psychedelics, absolutely. And so we feel real aligned with the work that they're doing, and they're expanding that work much more. And we're happy to be lined up with them. And of course, you and I, in talking about politics and spirituality. Just to go back a little bit, we both should do it because we come from opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, I'm from Montreal, and as you know, we Canadians, are fairly apolitical, and I grew up in a completely apolitical household, and we didn't even know we had a government. Once the Queen came by, and my parents took me down there, I was like 5 years old in Montreal, and it was like we actually went and hailed the Queen, which is, I know, our closeness to you there, Mr. Silver. But and your household, though.
don't drag me into this. I just work here. But yeah, we came from totally different backgrounds because I grew up in the north of England, and my family was to the left of Stalin, my father and mother. And we were indoctrinated with socialist and communist propaganda from the age of 0 to 15. So even though I did kind of transcend that a little bit when I went to university, it's still in me. And that sort of left liberal progressive thing is part of my life. And so it is an issue for me and for Raghu in different ways as to how do you interact with politics and activism now, and how did we? And what are the inherent, sort of conflicts, even contradictions, in being on some kind of spiritual path and being effective to try and make things better in the society.
Yeah.
So what do you want to say about that, Raghu?
Well, first I want to say that although we were way apolitical, and then growing up in the 60s and all, I mean, there was a war in Vietnam, so we certainly were at the very least, emotionally involved against the war. But ultimately we were also involved as we were down at the border there and shuffling people over, at least a couple of people. One I ended up in our little commune with, not commune, it was like a house with a bunch of us in there, whose name is Jesse Winchester, actually an incredible singer-songwriter from Memphis, Tennessee, and he's still up there. He never went back, although he got a pardon at one point. So as some of you know, if you've listened to Mindrolling, we, in my case, ended up in California, and David, spent some time out there as well at that time, and we talked about, in my experience, was getting tear gassed and getting high and thinking, boy, this is a great place out here. Even the air gets you high, and that's how political we were at that moment. I think, though, that one interesting thing, we certainly became involved in the spiritual movement, quote unquote, meaning we were all interested in Eastern stuff, and we were studying different things. We were listening to Krishnamurti, and so on and so forth, and Gurdjieff, you've talked about in your family. But I remember looking askance at people who were out there throwing bottles at the Bank of America windows, because it didn't seem much different than the tear gas that was coming back. I mean, it was just everybody, as much as they were polarized, they were seemingly coming from a very similar place. And obviously anger is the common denominator there. Dave, what do you think about that? And yeah, go ahead.
Well, at that time, going back to then, the war was so virulent and so atrocious to everybody, that it was very hard not to be angry. But in the years since, not to manifest anger and be even violent. But I was a little more involved than you were. But I was never into the weathermen end of it, the real sort of activist thing. Literally, bombs were thrown. Now it's not that different. I mean, we're talking about now and then a lot, Raghu and I, and the politics now of 2012 and 2013, which is what we're talking about right now. People got incredibly angry in the election of Obama, re-election of Obama. The awful shootings that have taken place with AR-15 assault rifles brought up the whole gun lobby, and Facebook is just absolutely ablaze with it. And I found myself taking part in that a little bit, but trying to cut out the adjectives. And just stick to the facts and see if we, at least from our side, we wouldn't be so crazed. And I think that gets back to something that we talked about in the 60s and 70s too, which was how could we reconcile trying to follow a path of love and peace and devotion with fighting things that were clearly awful before civil rights. I mean, I remember before civil rights. So one had to stand up against that. But Martin Luther King Jr. showed us how to do that. He really did. I mean, his Gandhi-esque approach to a nightmarish situation in the United States of America, particularly in the South, but everywhere, was to be a peaceful warrior. So from that, I learned a lot from MLK, honestly. Mm-hmm. Didn't you, Roger, really?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, total hero then, now. I have a little piece here that I thought I would play. That it's something that Ram Dass gave a talk. It's quite a while ago, 20, 30 years, whatever. And in that talk, he relates his own experience around this subject. So I thought, why don't we just play this for a minute? It's just a minute long or something, and then we can talk about that. Hang on, let me see if I can get this to work.
Certainly the 60s were the period of LSD and the Haight-Ashbury, and that wasn't political in large part. That was spiritual and consciousness. And there was a lot of political activism. That was a very fruitful, exciting, powerful time, the 60s, and we're still sort of reverberating from that. The problem that happened in the 60s was that it polarized between the spiritual and the political people, and that the political people felt, look, you can't go work on yourself when you're sitting in the middle of a mess that could explode any time. We've got to clean up the world first before we work on ourselves. And the spiritual people felt that the world is a reflection of the inner turmoil in people and the inner confusion, and you have to work on yourself first in order to work on the world. So that it polarized, and I remember having very sort of angry discussions with people like Jerry Rubin and Allen Ginsberg and people like that. Now here it is 10 years later, and we watch what happened to the Chicago 8 or 9, and we see that Allen Ginsberg is a student of Trungpa Rinpoche, and Dave Dillinger is a very spiritual guy in many ways, and Jerry Rubin has been through the Fisher-Hoffman method, and on and on. They began to realize that they had inner work to do, because they saw that if they protested against something in which they saw that which they were if they were attached to their anger, they kept creating the hell they were trying to get rid of all the time. And so it wasn't clear that they did incredible things. I mean, the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate and a lot of things have happened that are the result of incredible political activity. But at the same moment, there was a lot of paranoia and anger created as a result also. So that I think that the political people became more conscious that, just like scientists realize, an experimenter realizes that the experimenter is part of the experiment, so a political activist realizes that his being or her being is part of the political action.
So what's amazing about that talk from Ram Dass is the things that he's talking about then are absolutely so relevant. And by the way, I think this talk was from 1979 at BAI in New York, and he's of course speaking of the 60s, but then talking about 10 years forward from there. But basically there was a major polarization of people into spiritual, looking at just within that world, and were very apolitical. I was one of those people, for sure. And then the political people were looking down, like, you are just sitting around, contemplating your navel. You're useless, But then what he says, Ram Dass says in this thing that's interesting, is that people like Ginsburg and so on, became involved with different practices. Buddhism in Ginsburg's case. Who was it? Dave? Who he was talking about?
Trump. Well, he his involvement with Trump, but then he was talking about Dave Dellinger,
Yeah,
who was one of the Chicago 8 protesters who was in court with Abbie Hoffman.
right.
They all in some way became spiritual, but then so did the Beatles. The Beatles were political, and then suddenly they were exposed, John Lennon in particular, to all kinds of weirdness coming out of angry revolutionaries, so-called. And I wanted actually, Raghu, to read something from John Lennon's song Revolution, the Beatles song, which sort of says what happened. We all turned a little bit like this. Part of the song, he says, "You say you got a real solution. We'd all love to see the plan. We're doing what we can. But when you want money for people with minds that hate, all I can tell is, brother, you have to wait. Don't you know it's all going to be all right?" So he said then that he wouldn't get involved in violent protest, but would still remain, this was John Lennon, in the activism that had to take place in women's rights, gay rights, violence, the whole thing. And I think people now, without sounding like pontificating, but, know that in those days, it was a big mix. It was a big stew of people trying to find their inner life, but being absolutely outraged by what was happening in the society, and then having to deal with that. And Ram Dass spoke so eloquently about that, right, Raghu, about, just not giving the anger back. He was so good at that. He really was, is still good at showing us how to be detached from the anger, but it doesn't stop the intensity of the of the activism. Right. Just like right now, when people say natural gas is fracking gas, they're not joking. That's such a terrible problem for so many parts of the United States now, and you have to do something, I think. But you can't get crazed and angry at the people that are doing it, I guess.
Well,
Would you like to expand on that, please?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, sir. I will certainly. You know what, though? The truth is, I think that what we're seeing is when we talk about these are issues, Ram Dass was talking about these issues from the 60s, and, they haven't changed. These guys that did go out, Dillinger and Ginsburg and whoever else, and even Jerry Rubin, and they did make some changes inside themselves. They didn't stop, going out there and doing the social activism that they were doing. They didn't stop doing it, and they blended that in with what they were, that was developing some spiritual compassion, heart of compassion. What was still something that they continued to do. Are we missing some of that today when we see the vast polarization? And I think there's a natural thing. Again, from my own point of view, I just read, for instance, an article in Rolling Stone today from Matt Taibbi about the bailout of these banks. I mean, holy God, it's atrocious what's gone on here, and what's that these people have been not just let off the hook, but he got a Ponzi scheme going still, using the government's money. I mean, it's an incredible article. It's the article with Jimmy Fallon, is it, on the front cover? I think. Anyhow,
Kimmel. I think it's
Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah, not
okay.
Jimmy Fallon.
Who's watching? I mean, right now, I hear today on C-SPAN that they still are not really seriously considering bringing back the Violence Against Women bill, which they let expire. And I mean, every single woman senator has voted for bringing that back, because it's an outrageous thing, isn't it? That this thing, which really did help people who were being battered, deal with it in a serious way, and it also helped the police force deal with it in a consistent way. So those kind of things, I guess we still have to be, if we're not passionate about it, then we're not really doing right by the very core of yoga and Buddhism, which is
Compassionate action.
service, And I don't want to sound like a self-righteous person, because I really criticize myself all the time for not doing enough about these kind of things, because sometimes it's really overwhelming. I mean, what are you going to do about the fact that we've still got tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other all over the planet? I mean, they haven't gone away just because people aren't talking about it. They have not gone away. They're there. Now, the difference between me now and then was I used to get so crazed I'd be ranting, like Alex Jones or something. But now I don't rant, because you get older and you realize that didn't help. It just creates, as you said, Raghu, the polarization gets worse. So how do we assuage that? How do we assuage that so we can meaningfully maintain the fight, the struggle, but not let the anger rub off on us,
well,
and therefore end up in a contradictory and primitive.
Yeah, which is obviously part of our evolution. Well, again, you mentioned that there was again Ram Dass has really addressed this, because he has been involved for all these years with social activism and political activism, and his part has been to advise. I'm going to talk about a group that he has helped found and advise from the very beginnings, that is involved in social activism. But I think this is key. He said, in terms of solving this crucial and critical issue of being able to take social action and make it effective, you have to create a new way of consciousness. It's a new level of thinking about them. You have to break the set. I think that's the biggest thing, because when I was talking about reading this Matt Taibbi article in The Stone, I got all angry. God, these people, and Obama, how can he let this happen? This is robber barons, are the whole 9 yards, and I got all the vitriol, and so, I immediately recognize that we are so caught in this polarization, caught in the set, that the wave. We're caught in that set, and we do need to break the set. And how do we do that? I mean, there has to be more mass conscious. He talks about when there's any kind of confrontation, the confrontation usually increases the amount of hurt and anger and polarization ultimately. No matter what the short-term gain is, there's a long-term loss in increasing paranoia. In high energy centers in the country, that polarization and paranoia seems to precipitate out much faster. Obviously, there's many more people be able to gather in small confines in huge numbers. If I identify with any side of any position, then that attachment to that side makes me see the opposite side in terms of an object as them. Seeing another being as them is what the problem is. That's what it boils down to. And that, how to break that set, that requires a lot of self-searching and a lot of work on oneself. And again, as we both say over and over on this podcast, the last thing we need to do is pontificate about the shit that we are propagating ourselves day to day. And I certainly feel right in the midst of that. So it is a very difficult situation, but it's taking one small step around mindfulness, I think, is a key. You?
Absolutely. That's what I mean. Totally. The mindfulness comes in the presentness, and understanding that this is all, as the Beatles said, all things will pass, must pass. So don't get too crazed about it, and keep your sense of humor, but don't stop trying to mitigate some of the terrible iniquities that we see all around us. We can only, the Navajos used to say, Raga, that you could only deal with people you could see from your teepee, in a way of service, in a way. Another part of the tribe would be too far away to think about. Well, now we have 7 billion people that we know about because of media. And so what do you do? And we know now in the Central Democratic Republic of Congo, I think that's Democratic Republic. There are atrocious child armies, rape as a weapon. So it's overwhelming. And as you said before, you can only do one step at a time. But I think it is true that once you become aware of these, terrible things, Ramdas has always, and others have said, if you can't maintain that presentness and lightness of being, you won't help the situation. But look, we do see all kinds of things being changed by people being tremendously activist. It is going on. I wanted to ask you something, or bring up something right now, which is, of all people, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the world's most profound articulator of peace and love, forgiveness, and kindness. In the last few months, we've seen a tremendous increase in the self-immolation of Tibetan monks in Tibet because of the severity of the Chinese oppression, occupation. What do you think about that, Raghu, really? I mean, what does it make you feel when you see those incredibly dedicated spiritual beings?
I can't imagine.
What is going on here? Is that necessary, or is it, in other words, is anything going to get done by just talking about love and peace? Or do some people have to actually sacrifice in a Christ-like way their incarnation to show the world that this is terrible, that the situation in Tibet is absolutely execrable, hideous? And yet no one's talking about it except, rock stars and people on the spiritual path and other, but we're not really concerned about it.
Well, as far as the United Nations go, and as far as the powerful nations, they're all completely afraid of China. So there's no way that any one of these governments or institutions, it's.
Yes.
What I think of when I read this or see this, I do think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I think of the pain that he must experience when this happens. And I think that did he not say that as far as the act, which normally is an act that causes incredible karma. I think he even said that that would not take place with these monks in terms of committing that act. Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I don't, but I do remember that when the same thing was happening in Vietnam, with the Buddhist monks in Vietnam in the late 60s, it did bring tremendous attention, even more attention, to the horror of the situation. So in that sense, they probably did save lives. And in this way, I'm a perfect example. I see on the Huffington Post a picture of a burning monk, and then I realize that 50 of these gentle people have done this in the last few months. And it aroused me to, oh my goodness, it hasn't gone away. It's difficult because we've got problems in New York City that we need to deal with, and in North Carolina and everything. So you can't do everything. But the one thing you can do, we keep going back to it, I guess, is this: no matter how horrific it seems it is, you still have to deal with it with a certain kind of presentness and detachment and compassion, even for those that are the perpetrators, which is real tough. Raghu, maybe could you play that other Raghu piece, which is about that? It's about how do you deal with an entity which could be an enemy, and how do you deal with that, with an enemy, really?
Okay, here we go. This is another bit of a talk that Ram Dass gave during that same time. Was an interview with the BAI.
I learned a delicious lesson because I arrived at Heathrow Airport in London to be guest speaker for the World Symposium, and I went through the immigration, and I was down picking up my bag, and I felt a hand on my arm holding me tightly, and the man said, "Well, sir, you nearly got away from us." And I said, "I didn't know that I was trying." Turned out that since 1966 I had been on the Home Secretary's list of, it's called People Who Are Non-Conducive to the Welfare of the United Kingdom, because of my connection to Tim Leary and drugs and so on. And so I was brought upstairs to the detention room where for 10 hours, I guess, I was there with a group of delightful Pakistanis, Iranians, and Indians, all of whom were non-conducive to the welfare of the United Kingdom. And we had I couldn't have spent a more delightful day. And we were led to the bathroom with armed guards and taken in armed buses to cafeteria where the cook would open a locked window and hand out the food and lock it again in case we should leap through the window and attack her. And finally, at around 5 or 6 o'clock, they decided that I was really too bad to let in. And then they couldn't find an airline that would take me out of the country. I wanted to go to Amsterdam. Finally, they got Persian Gulf Airlines to take me. And they delivered me to the plane with armed guards, explaining to the stewardess that I was being deported. And all the people in the plane were watching me to wonder what kind of was I a sex maniac or was a bomber, a mad bomber? So I went to Amsterdam, but World Symposium had gotten on the case, and they got involved with the Member of Parliament and the Home Secretary, and the next Tuesday I was invited back in, met by a government official with a warm welcome, and he and I discussed the fact that people could change and that I was now really a good guy and that I loved England. So first of all, one of the profound things that I noticed about myself and my changes was that I thoroughly delighted in the day, because I wasn't really attached to how my days come out, and finding myself in detention for a day when I was about to be received by a world symposium and it's treated like a crook all day was as interesting and delightful as it could have been the other way, which blew my mind that it could be that way. And the other thing is that I understand the predicament of governments, and I don't feel that they were doing anything other than protecting the people of their government, which is what they're supposed to do. If they let in people who are in any way destructive to the fabric of the culture, they're held responsible for that. And we have a very funny thing where we're caught between a tremendous paternalism we invest in our governments and then a tremendous demand for independence. And we're independent until something goes wrong, and then we want to blame the big daddy for doing wrong. And I think there's a very delicate balance. Every time I come to the United States, I'm searched, and I go through that. And I keep explaining to them I'm not that guy anymore. But the computer runs slowly, and I think you have to develop a sense of humor instead of making everything. If I'm going to fight issues, I'd rather fight more interesting issues. It seems to me that the development of compassion, the concept of compassion, is some combination of human feelings and being in the world and feeling all the feelings of pity and pain and suffering and hope and joy and sadness, and also a kind of an equanimity of mind that comes from seeing that it's all kind of a dance and it's all quite perfect God's law unfolding. And it's that balance that's really where compassion lies. And with compassion, it seems to me, you develop an appreciation of what karmic predicament other beings are caught in. And you can see sort of why they are the way they are. And it is true that very often in order to fulfill your role as a citizen or as a human being, you have to act against another person's actions. You have to stop it or control it or protest against it. But the question is whether that other being is their action or is a being who is caught in a web of stuff of which the action is a result. And I constantly look and try to make contact because I identify with my own soul or spirit. That's what I see in other people. I mean, it really is, you see the projection of your own reality outside. So I just feel like I'm meeting a lot of souls that are each going through their own working out of stuff.
Oh.
I mean, it just goes to show that it doesn't change. He knew intuitively that the way to deal with these problems was to move towards it and embrace it in a way, and then to see that network of that context of karma around the other person and try your best to show compassion to that position that being finds themselves in. I wanted to just say something about that based on the personal experience. Raghu and I try and talk about things that we actually experienced. And as I said before, my father was a very left-wing guy, and basically the person in England the person that he despised most on the planet was definitely Richard Milhous Nixon, the vice president to General President Eisenhower. And so I grew up with constant ranting about how terrible Nixon was. In 1968, I was working at WGBH TV in Boston, and they asked me to do an interview with then Republican candidate Richard Nixon on youth issues, because I was a youth. The vote for people at 18, legalization of marijuana, and the draft. So I met Richard Nixon, and it was a very hard thing for me to do because it was like, doing an interview with Satan in terms of my conditioning. It so happens that we got along very well. I spent 3.5 hours with him in Boston in April of 1968 and found him to be extremely affable and very curious man. I don't mean curious odd. I mean, he was full of curiosity. This did not stop me from really loathing his policies in Vietnam and other matters. But as a man, I was actually able to get through to him. He really interrogated me about various things about England and about why English people didn't like him. And he was very vulnerable and kind of quiet. I was eventually ushered out of the hotel suite by his extremely mean-spirited aides. But, that was a lesson for me at the age of 24, that this was my father's most hated person. I had to deal with him. I had to do this interview. And as a man, he wasn't particularly repulsive or aggressive. So I found common ground there. Did it change my opinion about his actions? Absolutely not. But it lessened my anger. It actually did. So I even knew back then that there was something about opening your heart, having a quiet heart, a quiet heart around adversity that somehow made you less dogmatic and obnoxious, You know what I mean, Raga?
Yeah. I think you just gave a perfect example, actually, for what we just heard, actually. Ram Dass's talk, it was a funny talk about getting stopped in England and all of that. And I think that it is absolute. What you said is, and what caught my ear was when he talked about experiencing humanness, human feelings. You start to get down to that level, and then you are sitting with Nixon, and you're just one human being with another, no matter what his politics are, what actions he's taken, and you're feeling that person, and then it starts to be something else, and then you realize, okay, he's caught where he's caught, and sometimes the actions that he's taken are as a result of the circumstances that created that. His environment, his training, his brainwashing, maybe by whatever at that moment whatever the Republican Party was into, and finding that whatever common ground. I think that we have to do that. That is not easy, though, to find that common ground. And once you have that, you have some small shot at compassion, about not thinking of that person as the other. So I think this is key, and your example is a tremendous. I don't even remember that story, actually.
I haven't talked about it much because the truth of the matter is, for weeks after that, I was berated by my activist anti-Vietnam friends in Boston, because this was in the paper that this happened. And, they really got on me about it. But I stuck to my guns and said that, no, I wasn't going to idolize Richard Nixon and never vote Republican, heaven help me. But I did see that there was a man behind there. I mean, Ramdas says in that piece such a beautiful thing. He says, I think he said, see why they are the way they are. If you can just step back that much, to see why they are the way they are, it doesn't change the badness of something they may do, but it stops you from wanting to kill them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, the whole thing about developing a sense of the humanity of each person that you're dealing with is key. I mean, you can't take any action unless you can develop that, and it goes a long way to the beginning of developing some kind of heart of compassion. These are all big words, I mean, there's and some pontification, because I'm sure I'm going to go out and I'll see the news and see some horror that's gone on, and I'm going to, inside myself, I'm going to react. and I'm going to, a stream of epithets, I'm sure, will come out of my mouth.
Raghu, when I a couple of weeks ago heard that there were 63 or 65 Republican senators who refused to pass the bill for Hurricane Sandy, when I'm living here and I've seen thousands of people still without, water, electricity, and ravaged lives, and that's one thing that the government can help them with. And these 63 congressmen rather, voted absolutely against it. And it's not surprising that they were from certain areas of the country. I was furious, absolutely furious, and I wrote this long thing for Facebook. And then I got a phone call which lasted an hour and a half, and I looked at my posting about these 60 guys and had to take it down because I saw such anger in it. I knew it wouldn't help. I just knew it. And that's a recent example of my anger. I was so angry with them. How could they not have compassion for these poor people in Staten Island and Long Island and the Jersey Shore whose lives have been absolutely destroyed, probably by something which is caused by climate change. So there we go. The circle of that. Lack of ignorance. How do you not get angry at that? You're so right, though, man. You are. I mean, I'm angry now. I don't want to.
I know. This is a really difficult thing. It almost takes, like, maybe if you were sitting with one of those senators, you have some shot, right? Because you can get into, like you did with Nixon. I'm here. There's nothing I can do. Like, I'm having this meeting with this person for whatever reason, and you immediately feel the common ground because that's what we want to do. We don't want to be in conflict with people. Although there is some part of us too that loves loves being, we have our great group, like that Wall Street thing. What's it called?
Occupy. Yeah.
Occupy Wall Street. That movement, which is the most recent kind of movement that would be tangential to stuff that went on in 30, 40 years ago. And I have lots of friends who are, have gone down and taken part in it. And one thing I find is a certain enjoyment about being us and them. There's they're happy to be us and kill the them. And, I can easily go there with them and they want me to go there with them, and it's a tough situation because there's actually some satisfaction being gained by feeling like you're part of a that group that's against that other group,
Exactly. I mean, how do you deal with this, sort of mass killings of children? I mean, it's like a biblical thing from the Revelations about end days. It's so awful and hideous. But I think, just to get back to a moment to Ramdas's, brilliance in terms of the present. It never fails if you can just pull it back and turn it down many notches to give you better wisdom into how to deal with something atrocious. It didn't work for 6 million Jews and many more million other people in Germany during the Nazi regime because it went too far beyond. And it was beyond the ability of anyone to fight them back. The only miracle you can think of there is the fact that they lost the war. They probably should have won it given their cunning. But that's another issue altogether, which is, how do you not get very exercised and angry about something which is just killing people? Not just iniquities or bank problems, but actual people being murdered on the planet at the same time, like in Rwanda and Serbia and, many, many places in our experience. I think that's extremely difficult, and I can't pontificate about that, just like you said, because every single day you have to kind of work on that, I guess. How do I not get crazed?
Yeah, well, now you've taken this over the cliff, Dave. I mean, God, now I'm completely depressed. This is way too much, and so I want to counterbalance it with something slightly positive.
It's okay.
Jeez, I mean, the Nazis, the whole thing. I mean,
I'm sorry. We can edit that out.
Nah. What I do want to give a positive experience that I had related to social action in the fall of last year. This is another reference with Ram Dass, and what can we say? It seems to be is like a large part of our lives because we work on. Dave and I work for the Love Serve Remember Foundation, ramdas.org, and we create all sorts of. We have 40 years of. Like 1,000 hours of media. It's amazing stuff. So we've been creating different things with Ram Dass and friends. He's just, we have him from everything from Daniel Ellsberg to Allen Ginsberg to Deepak Chopra to God knows, right? So we do a lot of stuff there. So he comes up a lot because he's been a rudder, and he was a rudder for. So I'm telling you about. I went to a thing called the Social Venture Network. These are entrepreneurial social activists, and they get together a couple times a year, and they invigorate each other to move forward and more to do things that will be positive influences and make change in our world. And a wonderful group of people that Ram Dass was helped the founders, like, I don't know, what, 15, 20 years ago. And he was the representation of the spiritual heart of compassion, that you cannot lift a finger to make a change unless you first lift that finger within yourself. And so he got that credo going in this organization. I walked in there, I hardly knew anybody. Dave came to visit one day, and we talked to some people, and you can comment after this and say your experience, but mine was that these people truly did. They asked them to, the presenters, please leave your ego at the door, leave your role at the door. And there was a tremendous amount of interaction, in many ways through breakout groups, et cetera, presentations of people doing the most incredible good works around the world. I mean, I was blown away. We're talking about the likes of Ben and Jerry, the ice cream guys, and they've been there since the very beginning, and so on. A lot of these kinds of people who are really trying to do the right thing, but they are absolutely taking seriously the notion of working on themselves to get themselves into a place where they're not railing angrily out against whatever they're taking social action for. And so that is like the first baby step, and they're doing that. And so there is, and of course we hear, there's other people that are doing. We have Dr. Larry Brilliant, who is good friends of ours, and was in India with us when we were there many years ago. And Larry works for Jeff Skoll, and Jeff Skoll, who was a major person at eBay and obviously very wealthy, and he started a foundation, and he's doing movies and doing this, that, and the other. And they are going around the world and hitting at the biggest things that are affecting, from climate to pandemics to even this situation in the Middle East. And they are absolutely, I know Larry, and I know where he's coming from, is absolutely working on himself as he's doing this stuff. He is not caught in the polarization. He is definitely a great example of somebody who is doing this. And so there are positive things going on in this world and I would say, if we talked about this in the very beginning, the polarization of spirituality, people on the spiritual path, and political activists, that and taking social action. And I do believe when Ram Dass said in that talk before that people like Jerry Rubin in those days and Alan and Dave Dillinger were starting to do stuff on themselves, so that they didn't stop doing what they were doing, but they certainly were integrating it. I think that is happening way more now. I think we are in a very positive flow.
You were talking on a macro level with the SVN stuff, but think about our friend Bhavani and her radio show and website, I Eat Green. I mean, it's totally beautiful, holistic way of eating and keeping yourself healthy. But she does mention issues, GMO issues and so forth, on her website constantly and on her show, even though she's talking about cooking. She's still maintaining an awareness of what relates to food that she finds extremely, spurious, to say the least. And GMOs are a big part of it. Well, Bhavani is just a friend who's doing this, and She's not a major corporation, but she's making a dent in whoever listens to her or looks at her website. She does me. She educates me every time I read her website, you know. So there's tons of that going on. We didn't have these tools in 1968. All we had were the streets. I mean, we weren't on network television. No one was listening. And eventually, you know, Walter Cronkite noticed that there were millions of people walking through the streets and started talking about it, and that helped end the war. Now people have access, you know, to the internet. It gets back to that, Raghu, you know, that people can have a tremendous positive effect by, you know, disseminating information that they're privy to. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought up the positive, you know, end of this, because I know that people at Reality Sandwich, for instance, and Evolver are not just involved in talking about awareness, but they're also involved in many social issues involving economics. Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economics, is amazing for those of you who don't know it. Just an astonishing work. And he's part of, you know, those people in New York City. People are doing more now because the tools of communication are simply amplified in a geometric way. It's just astonishing. More than that, quantum. I mean, what would we have done with the internet in 1968? You know, my goodness.
Well, it is absolutely true that has enabled a large swath of people being able to participate in social action through social networks. I mean, there's no doubt that that's going on. The Occupy thing was all about that. But you know, as much as all of this needs to be supported, and there's no doubt about that, you have to act. Everybody has to act, even if it's just getting up and signing a petition on Facebook. But this other part has to be part of it. I mean, it absolutely, you know, the fact that as long as we are as soon as we look at somebody like other, we got to look back at ourselves. I mean, that's the first baby step that everyone has to take. So enough of that already, though. Yeah, I think that, by the way, the book you just mentioned, what's the name of the book you just mentioned?
Sacred Economics. And I've seen Mr. Eisenstein talk, and he simply puts together a much more, oh my goodness, you know, a truly spiritual, deep approach to the displacement of monies. And so that's an example of how, you know, I don't know whether he'd love the word spiritual. I'm not sure I do sometimes, but people who are involved in inner work, applying themselves to societal problems, such as, you know, you think of economics, you don't necessarily think that it's going to ever take in advanced thought or meditative stuff, but he's done that, and I recommend that book to anyone.
Do you think it's on audible.com? Because we have to mention one of our sponsors, audible.com, who has all these wonderful books that you can download and listen anywhere with great readers. And audible.com/mindrolling podcast will send you over there and get you a free month to get this thing going. Audible.com. So wanted to mention them. Any other thoughts, Dave? I think we're coming to the close of this.
Yeah, we are. I think, you know, even just during the sort of existential experience of doing this podcast, I've been, you know, you can't help but examine yourself. And I guess that's what everybody has to do in a way, you know. So why am I angry? And should I justify this anger because there's something so terrible happening? Well, got to look into yourself, you know, and it doesn't matter what tradition you're in, you know. I mean, if it goes anywhere from Ramakrishna to Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, you know, saying that, you know, turning the other cheek and forgiving but not forgetting is probably the right way to deal with some of this pretty difficult stuff.
Yeah. But you in particular, though, coming from this political activist family, and you're an, you know, well, we're both immigrants here. I was going to accuse you of being an immigrant that should, you know, this, you know, I think there needs to be a little bit more nationalistic spirit coming from you about America. I haven't.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I haven't.
America. I mean, I'd be nowhere. If I'd have, you know, moved from England to Tierra del Fuego, I'd be on a mountain really happy.
Well, listen, what about this, the paternalistic thing Ram Dass talked about? I mean, you should really feel that because you've been allowed, and me, to stay here. But you are still a citizen of England. You can be thrown out at any time. I actually got my...
It's called a green card. And by the United States Constitution, although I have no idea if it's in the Constitution, I'm allowed to do what I want. But I'm a member of the European community, and I'm happy because I want to be a member of all communities.
Yeah, well, that one's going down the drain, so you ought to be happy you're here. Folks, this is Mindrolling Podcast, mindrollingpodcast.com. We do have these lovely sponsors, but we depend on you guys to help support keeping Dave in the grub and me to get gas in my car, and because I got to do a lot of driving around North Carolina in those mountains. So just go to our website and donate if you can. That would be wonderful. We do appreciate the support, folks. We really do. And
like food, we like transportation.
Yeah. The other thing is, I'll tell you, Dave Silver is a wonderful man. He has created, if you go to mindrollingpodcast.com, you will see extras. And Dave has created on this most wonderful tips on different books and in playing videos and music and so on. I mean, he has done... What's your latest thing? What's up there now?
Up there now are 3 actual quotes from His Holiness Dalai Lama from a book called The Path to Tranquility. And it's very appropriate for all times, but for now, I think. And it actually relates to this podcast a little bit. Anyway, there are 3 quotes that I really treasure. And then before that, there's tons of other stuff. We put music on there that we like, and we put books and everything that sort of crosses our mind that we think would not hurt the planet a little bit. Yeah. So
and we may even have a T-shirt soon, Dave.
Yeah, what will it say? It's going to say, "Mind Rollers, mug your mind." Yes. If you like that, send money.
Yeah. All right. This is it. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you, Reality Sandwich. And you guys from Reality Sandwich that are listening to this, we'd love to have you on a weekly basis. And subscribe to the podcast. And we will see you next